So suppose that you could simply financialize or securitize against the risk of greater income inequality. Suppose, in other words, you could simply buy a hedge on a growing spread between some index of economic growth, like GDP, and some index of economic inequality, like the Gini coefficient. That would pay off, in other words, if it were true that economic growth actually creates greater income inequality. Well, then we wouldn't need universities, would we? The function of higher education in the economy could simply be replaced by that financial market. Because if people could buy this kind of insurance, it would be a more perfect proxy for protecting yourself against income inequality than, say, a degree in theater arts at UCSC, or, in my own field, political and social thought. So if you're a policy wonk, you can think of tuition as a proxy for a form of income insurance that doesn't really exist, the market for which is created by increasing fear that you will be a victim of growing income disparities, and that you have no political agenda for reversing the growth of income disparities by making essentially economic growth beneficial to people in all income groups, whether they have college degrees or not. We are all complicit in selling an idea of higher education in which income inequality is our most important product. Now, I've said that it's a hedge. How much tuition is a hedge? The reason universities think that people will pay more in tuition. My son, I told him he's at Berkeley, and I told him I would see him after I finish. How would we price the hedge? How much would people pay for such a hedge? Well, this is where modern finance theory helps us. In modern finance theory, the price of any hedge is independent of any subsidy that goes along with that hedge. So if higher education, if tuition is a hedge against income inequality, its price should be independent of whether it gets a state subsidy or not, just as it should be independent of whether it gets a subsidy from an endowment at a place like Harvard or Princeton. From a financial analyst point of view, in other words, the price of a hedge depends mostly because this is the exponential variable, mostly on the variance of the underlier rather than the mean. In other words, mostly not on whether mean income is going up or down, but whether the variance in income is going up or down. It's a square of the variance of income, in fact. The dispersion of income. So the dispersion of income can increase when the economy is growing. That's the new news. That's the good news for universities, is that the dispersion of income now increases even when the economy is growing. We always knew that the dispersion of income increases when the economy is shrinking. Either way, the price of tuition goes up because it's a square of the diversion. If it's a hedge on the dispersion, if it's a hedge on the dispersion. So from a financial analyst point of view, greater income dispersion or variance means a greater risk at the level of life prospects of being poor, because being poor is worse relative to being rich. And if both of these can be described simply in terms of the variable volatility, then greater volatility in income, in other words, greater income inequality, increases the amount that universities can charge, and that this is true whether they are public or private, whether they are endowed by the state or by donors. In other words, people who are able to buy this insurance might, but people who are not able to buy this insurance will go to university, regardless of how much it charges, and borrow in order to do so. So here's the deal. Students get to live on debt, perhaps a $100,000 line of credit, so that universities can raise revenue by taking an increasing cut of what students borrow and calling it tuition, which they sell to students by cutting instruction, even though they never restore instruction by raising tuition. That's the deal. Now, here are the facts. According to this theory, one would simply expect students to borrow more in order to go to university. In other words, willingness to borrow would not be a constraint, assuming that ability to borrow, eligibility, is not lowered, and the need to borrow is increased. Over the summer, I have been getting data dumps from friends in the Admissions and Financial Aid Office who actually have to make these tuition increases work by deciding whether or not to sell students on higher loans. And what they have told me is truly interesting. What they have told me is that student borrowing did go up in the 78 to 98 period, but that it has not increased at all in any income category between 98 and 2008. It remains at $13,000. Because students are, in fact, more rational than our university leaders give them credit for being. The obvious reason why student borrowing hasn't increased is that the financial aid people have held the line on what they are willing to recommend to students who borrow, because, in fact, the median income of UC graduates has not increased between 1998 and 2008, before the crash. In other words, the willingness to take on debt has not increased as tuition has gone up, which is exactly contrary to what UC's own theory would predict. Student loans, in other words, are justifiable for a UC degree only at the level of $9,000, which is what would be comfortably repaid at an 8% repayment rate per year. And that is what you would be able to repay with an average expected income 5 years out of about $35,000 to $38,000. And the financial aid people know this. And so what they say is that student enrollment at UC in the income band above financial aid, $112,000 to $134,000, has essentially dropped from 11% of the total to 7% of the total as tuition has gone up. In other words, instead of borrowing more for UC, it seems that middle-income people are holding their total debt constant by transferring down to CSUs and then community colleges, which are responding to this glut by turning them away because they cannot raise tuition as fast as UC. So the consequence of UC's theory, and that's why I am jumped at the opportunity to address the California Conference, the consequence of UC's approach to becoming increasingly reliant on student debt is that we have a master plan that is operating, but that is operating in reverse. Students who can't take on greater debt because of what happened in 2008 and won't take on greater debt because their expected median earnings go down or remain the same, apply to CSUs. Students who can't get into CSUs go to community colleges. Community colleges are cutting back on credit hours and courses. And we now have a report from people at Sacramento State showing that 70% of community college transfers are transfers for people who are, by people who are not UC eligible to for-profit institutions where they can live off credit if they're willing to pay tuition. In other words, what we have in California's system of higher education is in effect a single system that includes privates and for-profits, a single system that is funded by federal guarantees, which are in many ways the worst form of taxpayer subsidy for higher education, because they are destroying what was best about higher education in California, namely the public university system itself. No offense to those of you who are from private universities. And I want to tell you that if you read the internal documents of the financial aid people, you knew this before 2008, before the crash, when its internal documents reveal that it already thought that student borrowing, particularly in the middle income group, had reached the tipping point. Now, I think we are at a wonderful moment for political action here, because it turns out that these data show that UC's model for funding higher education, based on the notion that inequality will grow faster than the economy and the tuition is the price of a hedge against that. You understand the concept? Based on that notion, is in fact simply a generalization, or one might want to call it a limited universalization of what was the case in California during the high-tech boom. During the high-tech boom, you couldn't train specifically for the jobs that there were. And it turned out that during the high-tech boom, according to the 1998 Legislative Analyst Report, all California income growth occurred in the top 20%. The bottom 80% were left behind. So UC was, in 98, when I was on the Budget Committee, able to sell people on the idea that the taxpayers won't pay because they shouldn't pay. Why should 80% pay in order to be left behind? And if taxpayers won't pay, that's sufficient reason why students should pay, because being in the top 20% is pretty close to being UC or CSU eligible. And going to community college guarantees that you can become CSU or UC eligible under the master plan. These ideas made some sense during the era when income growth was broadly distributed within the top 20%, but 80% were left behind, which is not the case during the 1950s and 60s, the era that brought us the master plan. Made some sense, in other words, if you thought the era of the end of the Cold War was the future, and the end of World War II was the exception. That we were now, in other words, in a universal pattern in which all economic growth would henceforth be like the economic growth in California's transition from defense-led to technology-led economic development. It is now, however, equally plausible to regard this era, the era of privatization, as itself a transition and a conjuncture, and not as something permanent and structural. Why? Why? Because between 1998 and 2008, almost all income growth, even in the top 20%, was concentrated in the top 1%. The top 1%.